I've done a few shows on ancient Egypt and its past, and I was going to talk about ancient Egypt and the soul. And then I thought, no, I'm going to just read this introduction from a book called Myth and Symbol in Ancient Egypt by R.T. Randall Clark, because it explains everything I was thinking. So it begins. About 3000 BC, the Egyptians of the Nile Valley invaded and conquered the Delta. This was the beginning of the two lands, the first great nation-state. Since the system of picture writing known as hieroglyphs was being evolved at the same time, the union of Egypt marks the beginning of history. During the following 500 centuries, the Egyptians made very rapid advances in material culture, social organization, and government. This was paralleled by equally vigorous activity in the more intellectual spheres of literature and religion. By the end of the so-called Old Kingdom, about 2300 BC, the pattern of Egyptian civilization was complete. Much happened in the following 2 millennia, but there was no fundamental change until the conversion to Christianity in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. An Egyptian of the early dynasties would have been at home in the Egypt of the Roman Empire. He would have recognized the gods, the art, the methods of agriculture, and, with a little help, he would have been able to read the public inscriptions. The apparently fixed pattern of ancient Egyptian civilization is usually explained in terms of the unchanging system of irrigational agriculture, which has remained almost the same from the beginning of history until the present time. Now it is true that the modern fellah spends his time performing practically the same tasks as his predecessor did 4,000 years ago, and with very much the same tools. As a consequence, the peasants of today must resemble his remote ancestor in many ways. In fact, this is true in all sorts of things: music, humour, folk tales, birth, customs, diet, festivals, and attitudes towards the aged and children. But what may be valid for the peasantry has certainly not been the case with the leading sections of the people. The upper classes have been profoundly affected by political events, while conversion to Christianity, and then to Islam, completely changed the lives and outlooks of the educated. When we speak of ancient Egypt, we are not thinking of the unchanging world of the peasant, but the great world of the pharaohs and the priests, scribes, and artists who supported it. And this world, in spite of foreign invasions and political domination by Greeks and then by Romans, remained more or less intact until the 3rd century AD. It was Christianity that killed it in all its aspects. The inevitable conclusion is that Egyptian religion was the heart of the civilization. When that lost its nerve or was superseded, the rest fell apart. Any religion is a complex thing. Egyptian religion was especially so, partly because of the rich diversity of the civilization, but even more because it penetrated and informed every aspect of life. The Greeks were the first to discover spheres of activity which were independent of religious conditions or to be expressed in non-religious terms. Since then, but only intermittently, Western man has become accustomed to set experience into 2 divisions: church and state, clerical and lay, religion and science. The Egyptians belonged to the pre-Greek era, for there was no dichotomy. The gods were everywhere. The king was the essential priest, and all acts were played out against a background of divine patterns. Gods, men, animals, plants, and physical phenomena all belonged to the same great order. There were no distinct realms of being. Conception, germination, sickness, or chemical change were just as much God-directed as the motions of the stars or the beginnings of the world. The first and most characteristic mark of the religion was the ritual. This was built around a few basic ceremonies: a dedication rite known as opening of the mouth, the treatment of images in their shrines, the offering of Maat, the goddess of the world order, at the end of certain rites, the liturgy of offerings, the enthronement rites of the king, and the proyat, or public procession of the god. The various rites determined the calendar, primarily an arrangement of festivals, which was arranged with reference to the phases of the moon and governed by reference to the observation of Sirius, the dog star. The dispositions of the celebrants in these rites were the governing factor in the design of temples and tombs. And the ritual alphabet, so to speak, remained almost unchanged for several thousand years. However complex the services became, they were compounded of the same elements. One is reminded of how the Christian Church has been a place for the celebration of Holy Communion, and how this determined the layout of every building and provided the element of architectural continuity. Religious ritual is not just a series of actions performed for their own sake. These acts are symbolic, that is, they refer to things other than themselves, and this reference is always to something in the world of the gods. In Egyptian religion, there is a theology wound around the ritual, so that one cannot be considered without the other. The shrine of the god, for instance, was the horizon, the land of glorious light beyond the dawn horizon where the gods dwelt. The temple was an image of the universe as it now exists, and at the same time, the land on which it stood was the primeval mound which arose from the waters of the primordial ocean at creation. When, again, at the close of the daily temple service, the priests raised a small figure of Maat in front of the divine image. This act was meant to assert that rightness and order had been re-established, but it was also a repetition of an event that took place at the beginning of the world. It is vital to the spirit of Egyptian religion that the symbolism should be twofold. The rite was celebrated to ensure that divine grace should flow out into the affairs of mankind, but it also stood for the repetition of some mythical happenings in the time of the gods. A ceremony was meaningless without its mythical and theological references, and these were provided in the prayers, litanies, and hymns that accompanied the actions. Things done and things said were complementary. This is why there were two priestly roles in any service, the celebrant and the reader. The former was called the Sempti and wore a leopard skin draped over his back. The latter was the holder of the roll and was distinguished by a strip of linen passing over one shoulder like a deacon's stole. All the universal religions look back to some founder or particular revelation. This implies that they are deliberately different from the earlier cults and outlooks of the countries where they originated. Egyptian religion belonged to the older dispensation. It grew directly out of the customs of prehistoric farmers and herdsmen. In spite of much speculation, nothing definite is known about this early religion. It was obviously a collective business concerned with the prosperity of the community in terms of fertility and success in war and hunting. It was also devoted to the cult of the dead or ancestor worship and had an especial regard for the moon and stars. In one respect, the Egyptians remained, throughout their long history, addicted to these primitive attitudes. It is likely that the main cult of the prehistoric people was that of a mother goddess who was also the sky. This goddess worship seems to have been kept alive among the common people throughout the ages, reappearing in provincial censors, and whenever the official religion lost its grip, until finally it almost ousted all the other gods in the great expansion of Isis mysteries at the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Most of the ritual was a legacy from the prehistoric past, when it had been performed by semi-divine chieftains to ensure the continuation of the powers of nature. During the formative period of the first 5 dynasties, however, these ceremonies were transformed and reinterpreted to suit the requirements of new religious ideas. There is no doubt that the priests of Heliopolis and Memphis were the leaders in this practice, and that the centralizing kings of the time gradually forced the ceremonies of Heliopolis on the rest of the country. The process can be seen at work in the texts on the pyramids of the Old Kingdom, where the temple hymns have been taken from their context to provide the services of the then new funeral cult. It can be seen too very clearly in the rite of opening the mouth and the liturgy of offerings, which have been revised to fit the doctrines of Osiris. In other places one can see myths being composed to fit or justify the old ritual. The ritual was fixed, but the myth was elastic. Therefore the myths went on being revised and elaborated, particularly during the times of the kings of the 9th dynasty, but to some extent all through Egyptian history. In recent years it has come to be realized that Egyptian art is nearly all symbolism. The architectural arrangements and decoration were a kind of mythical landscape. This was worked out down to the last detail of the furnishing. Everything had a meaning or could be made to have one. Columns, capitals, walls, window lattices, Drainage outlets, gateways, screens and shrines all had significant traditional shapes with decoration indicative of mythical or theological schemes. The great temple halls, for example, with their papyrus-shaped columns, simulated a delta swamp in which the god's boat floated when it was carried out of the inner shrine in procession. The papyrus swamp, however, was not quite the earthly, but the reed marshes, the fairyland of the rising sun just beyond the eastern horizon. If we say that the architecture provided a background for the ritual, that is to make the one subordinate to the other, but in fact the visual arts, mythology and ritual were facets of one reality. An Egyptian temple appealed to the eye and the imagination at the same time. The full, sensuous impact of a great ceremony must have been very impressive indeed. In addition to what can be directly known, there must have been the music, the stately language of the prayers, and the prevailing atmosphere. But all had a deeper meaning, part mystical, part reasonable. Even so, the religion would not have persisted so long had it not been for the many ways in which it satisfied and enriched intellectual curiosity. The texts are full of explanatory asides and added notes, the acquisitions of generations of speculating or inquiring scribes. Many Egyptians were deeply aware that their myths and symbols expressed intuitions about the nature of God, man, and the universe, and that there could only be partial answers to the major metaphysical and spiritual problems. The difficult and perhaps insoluble questions that had bedeviled Christian theology are to be encountered in the literature of ancient Egypt. The rival claims of the immanent and transcendent concepts of God, for example, the paradox about the uncreated creator, the origin of evil, the male and female sides of the divine, or whether God exists in time. Such problems were already worrying the minds of men 2,000 years before Christ. They were most noticeable in the formative periods discussed in this book, but the rational spirit never died out, as can be seen from the enigmatic script of the Ptolemaic temples. In two ways, Egyptian religion is unique: in the elaborate theory which it wove around the monarchy, and in its preoccupation with the afterlife. Essentially, the pharaonic kingship was concerned with the same things as kingship everywhere. It grew out of the ideas and customs of the prehistoric chieftains of the Neolithic world. The real spirit, however, was created during the 3rd millennium BC in historical times. The pharaoh had a complex relationship with the divine world. He was the manifestation of the Godhead on earth, the Son of God as the Son, begotten through divine intervention. The ritual of the Osiris cycle connected him with the powers of nature. On the earthly plane, he was the supreme man, heroic warrior and hunter, champion of right, uniquely vigorous and virtuous. All beneficial power flowed into the world through him, so he was the only true priest, and all ceremonies were conducted in his name. Egypt was a union of two distinct regions, the Delta in the north and the Nile Valley in the south, and the king was the reconciler of the two. According to one symbol, he was the son of an earthly mother and a heavenly father, while according to another, he was born, or reborn, the child of the great mother goddess. All this was acted out in elaborate ceremonies and expressed in the 5 names which each pharaoh bore. The king belonged half to the world of myth. Egyptian legends describe the transformations of godly power from the first stirrings in the primeval waters until the final establishment of Horus, the first king, and the pattern of rule and authority. The cult of the dead has been responsible, one way or another, for preserving much of the remains of Egyptian civilization that we have. It penetrated into nearly every sphere of life. It largely dictated the system of land tenure. In need for permanent buildings was the stimulus for the erection of the first buildings in dressed stone, and more than the royal religion, it linked men with the powers of the unseen world. But in spite of all this, Egyptian ideas about the next world were not very precise. There were 2 quite distinct fates. According to one, the deceased joined his ancestors who were already lodged in the cemetery on the edge of the desert, and with them lived a carefree existence on the model of that on earth, or would do so if his tomb was properly attended to. The other belief was that the soul soared up to join the stars and the sun and moon in their eternal round. The difficulty is that both fates were believed in at the same time. The second idea was expanded considerably during the early Middle Kingdom. In order to reach the heights of the sky, the soul had to undergo those transformations which the high god had gone through as he developed from a spirit in the primeval waters to his final position as sun god, or into some of the assistants at those great events. It was this idea that made the cult of the dead an opportunity for creative speculation and gave scope for the elaboration of mythical detail in the funerary literature. Looked at skeptically, all this excessive preoccupation with the fate of the dead is foolishness and wishful thinking. The imposing facade of Egyptian culture seems to be nothing but an elaborate excuse for refusing to face up to the inevitable, and some Egyptians themselves felt this. On the other hand, the subtler texts are hardly about death at all, but are really about the nature of the human soul, and nature and God. Under pressure from crude minds, the scribes of the Middle Kingdom provided a paradise and several hells, but the majority of the texts provide alternative symbols of redemption rather than graphic descriptions of ultimate fate. However childish and magic-ridden the cult of the dead may have been, it was the way the Egyptian rose above collective religion into the realm of personal piety. The mythology had therefore to serve two purposes. It was to give up the steps whereby the universe was arranged, leading up to the final triumph of Horus and the coming of the pharaonic monarchy. The other purpose, only gradually understood, was to provide a series of symbols to describe the origin and development of consciousness. The theory of divine kingship was the stimulus of the one, the cult of the soul was the stimulus of the other. This sounds like the verdict of a modern psychologist, but it was already realized by the Egyptians themselves, although not in modern times. When they mythologized, they knew what they were doing. And that was the end of the introduction to the book Myth and Symbol in Ancient Egypt by R.T. Rundle Clark. And the reason I wanted to read it was because I was going to do a show about the soul in Egyptology, where he says that they had two distinct fates. You know, one went to the ancestors and the other went, the soul soared up to the stars, the sun and the moon. Well, I think the Egyptians believed in both. The Egyptians believed that people had 7 bodies. So when you died, there was like your shadow, there was the bar, the car, the ark. Oh, and now the other names have slipped my mind. But one of them bodies could well have gone to join the ancestors in the desert, to join them in the other world, in the afterlife. And another one of your bodies may well have gone up to join the stars, the sun, the moon, and join in with the cycle, the continuing cycle of the universe. And maybe another of your bodies, like they call it the bar, that's got the body of a human, the body of a bird, and your head, your human head on top of the bird. That's the bar. And the car, which is said to be the soul, can keep coming back and forth between the different realms. So even though this is a fantastic book, I do recommend it for those that are into Egyptology. I think one needs to ponder more on what they believed in with the soul and how it helps to develop oneself so that one can continue with life after death. And why these different bodies are needed, why we have 7 bodies. You know, today many people talk about the astral body, the etheric body and such like. You know, I think these are all the same bodies that the ancient Egyptians were discussing. So may your soul grow strong and grow on and grow long and live forever. Thank you for listening. And as I say, I have other shows on Egyptology throughout my back catalogue. Thanks everybody.